Bon, alors je vous invite à commencer tranquillement. Alors d'abord, je voudrais souhaiter la plus chaleureuse et bienvenue à Alice Chan qui est avec nous ce midi pour le dernier midi cridac de la session. Alors, il nous fait très, très plaisir de la recevoir ce midi. Alice Chan va nous parler aujourd'hui de l'enseignement des cultures religieuses pour lutter contre l'intimidation religieuse, teaching religious literacy to combat religious bullying from Montreal. So, je vais laisser la parole maintenant à Alice qui va pouvoir partager sa présentation. La présentation sera réalisée en anglais. Mais Alice a préparé une présentation PowerPoint qui a été traduite complètement en français pour permettre à toutes et tous de suivre là, aisément dans les deux langues. Donc, Alice va pouvoir prendre la parole pendant 30 minutes, puis par la suite, nous aurons une période de questions. Je laisse maintenant la parole à Alice. Alice, you can go when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. It's a pleasure to meet many of you, and thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. As Stephanie mentioned, my conversation will be in English, so thank you for your patience. For those who are Francophone and French speakers, my slides will be in French and the conversation in English, but absolutely, if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to ask the questions, either orally, feel free to unmute. This could be a great time for discussion and dialogue within the 30 minutes or even later on, whatever you prefer, but please feel free to type your questions anytime or ask your questions, interrupt me anytime in the language of your preference. If I don't understand it, honestly, my French is a work in progress. If I don't understand it, I know Camille and Stephanie will help me interpret and also address your questions. So thank you again so much for being here. Let me just start by sharing my screen. There we go. So thank you all for being part of this conversation. It is a chance to talk about how to teach religious literacy in order to combat religious bullying. The conversation today is high level of the book that I've written based on my dissertation on this topic. So I'm happy to share the details with you today at a high level. And as Stephanie mentioned, I am joining with many of you, I'm joining from Montreal. So the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, also known as Tshilhqot'in. So if you're learning more about unceded territory of Montreal and other parts of Canada, I encourage you to please check out these two sites, native-land.ca and whos.land, to learn more about perhaps the treaty territories that you belong to or the unceded territory and the peoples in the area. So today, much of my conversation is based on this book. I know that Stephanie has ordered this book already for the UQAM library, so it is on its way. So please don't worry about purchasing it if you are part of UQAM, but if not, and if your library doesn't have it yet, I encourage you to ask your library, invite your librarian to order this for you so you can get a free copy at your school. Myself, I am the director and co-founder of the Center for Civic Religious Literacy. I'm happy to talk about that later on during the Q&A if you'd like, but a lot of what I do now is really out of what I'm sharing with you today, the details within this book. So today our time will focus first on talking about the big topic of what is religious bullying? What is it? And then related to that, we'll talk about why context is really important in this conversation, and then how religious literacy relates to this whole conversation. And we'll conclude with some recommendations and general tips to hopefully inform you in your work, and then guidance for additional aspects on how and why this is an important topic for you. But as we begin, I think it's very important for me and for all of us to really consider, why are we talking about this in the first place? Where did this all start from? So very much for me, I never thought about religion, really, in society growing up. I grew up in the Toronto area with lots of friends from different religious and non-religious backgrounds. And I thought that's just how society is. That's life. We don't really need to talk about it. Everybody does their own thing. And so when I was working in an office space, headquarters of a large international company, but based in the Toronto area, I noticed that in 2005, around December, there were a lot of employees who were upset and uncomfortable around the different holidays that were coming up. And they didn't know how to communicate it. And some people felt that their holiday was disrespected. And this was a big event. And the first time I had seen tensions like that in a professional workspace. So I made a note of it, but just set it aside. And it didn't really come to mind again until 2011. So from 2005 to 2011, I became a teacher around that time in 2011. And as I was teaching, I realized that in society, in the Toronto area, there was a lot of conversation about religion. So here there's just 3 images of 3 different articles where they talked more about religion in schools, religion in society. And I thought, okay, that's different. What's happening? And so I made this observation, but it didn't really speak to me clearly until in 2011, personally, when my father passed away, very unexpectedly. And it was very difficult because it was unexpected. And myself, I'm a Christian. And so at that time, when the society was talking about religion overall, my own religion was really important in my life to understand what had happened and to understand what was happening in my life and just to deal with my dad's death. And at the same time, during that same year, in the grade 7 and 8 classes that I was teaching in the Toronto area, so that's Sec 1 and Sec 2 classes, a student came to me and said, "Miss, he's bullying me." And as I looked and tried to understand the situation more, I realized that the student was being bullied because of a complex mix of perceived identity aspects related to the color of his skin. And at that time, as a new teacher, I realized, oh my goodness, 1, there's bullying, so I have to address this. But 2, this bullying related to religion, an aspect of an assumed identity about the student because of the color of his skin. But how do I talk about religion in a public school? I realized at that time I was completely unprepared. I did not have any answers, and I just had many more questions. And so at that time I had completed and I was doing my master's, and I realized, no, I have the skills, I have the questions, and there's a need to explore this topic of religious bullying. So that's what I did. For my master's, I went into my PhD to talk about and explore what is this thing, religious bullying, and how can it not only help me as an individual, but help other teachers once I find the answers, and also, of course, students and parents that are part of the school environment. So this is what I found. I found that in terms of religious bullying, it's very complex, and similar to this image here. So if you look at this picture, my question is, what do you see? So as we look at this picture, it seems, there's 2 young people on a seesaw, and they're balanced because nobody has their feet on the ground. But when you look at it closer, the one on the left is bigger in size than the one on the right. And the one on the right kind of seems like they're holding on. That could be a comfortable position, or it could be I'm holding on trying to stay balanced. And then the one on the left is sitting up straight, potentially very comfortable, or we don't know. And they're looking at each other, but one is sitting up taller than the other. And so what does that mean? And so when I saw this picture, I felt this really describes what bullying incidents are, that it's complex, and each one, when you look at it at surface level, is not that simple. You really need to analyze them some more to understand what's happening, because it's a dynamic between two different parties. And so the green details here, this is generic to all types of bullying. There is a power imbalance, and one group intentionally aims to degrade and put down another group. And the groups could be one person against another, or one group of people against one, or two groups against each other. It varies. So this is what I found common between religious bullying and other forms of bullying. But as I read more studies, as I spoke with different individuals in California and Quebec, specifically Modesto, California, and Montreal, where I did my study, I realized, this is much more complex. And so the yellow details are what's unique about religious bullying. That first, religious bullying is about a person's actual religious identity or non-religious identity and their perceived identity. So what that means is somebody can put down another based on the affiliation someone has. So someone could say, I am a Christian. And so for that reason, that's why they're bullied. Other times, people are bullied because of a perceived identity. And this happens very often to those who are Sikh because of their skin color and the fact that they wear a turban. For a lot of people who are not familiar with what Sikhism is and who Sikh people are, they may assume that they're Muslims. And for that reason, people have been, in the US, for example, people have been killed for being Sikh because they thought, those who were killing them thought they were Muslims. And similarly, students have been bullied for being Sikh because people thought that they were Muslims. So that's a few examples of how identity is part of this, their perceived and their real identity, as well as people are bullied because of what they actually believe, the tenets of what they believe, the principles of what they believe. And so this happens often towards Hindu students, for example, where many people will say Hindu people believe in many gods, but there's only one God, or there aren't that many gods, there's no God at all. So how could you say that, why do you believe in this? And so that's another example of people being bullied based on their actual beliefs, not who they are, but their beliefs. And so there's many examples, but what I found is this religious bullying really happens within and among many groups. One, it happens within religious groups, so that when we think of, for example, Northern Ireland, there's a history of those who are Catholic against those who are Protestant. And there's bullying as well as deaths. There's extreme levels of bullying and discrimination and harassment in some contexts because of this type of tension between groups and power dynamics between groups. And then there's also, so that's within the Christian community, those who are Catholics and Protestants. As well, this type of bullying happens between groups. So it will happen in schools, I'm familiar with, where students who are Muslims and who are Hindus are told not to play together because of their parents. And so in school, the interaction plays out between the students because of their backgrounds and because of the national and ethnic heritage they have from another country and politics from that country. And also this happens very much towards those who are non-religious from people who are religious, and vice versa. So it is very complex, and really the name religious bullying is just a broad name to start the conversation. This is also complex because if we look at the intersectionality of individuals, some groups experience this more than others related to their class, their race, or their sex or gender, depending on where you are in the world and who the person is. So for example, in Canada, sadly, it is often Muslim girls who wear the hijab who are bullied in schools because they are visibly religious, and they wear the hijab because they are Muslim, because they are girls. And often the color of their skin is darker. And this come in Canada, at least, and this comes together in play in many different levels of power dynamics when we talk about intersectionality. So in my study, And I'm happy to answer any questions you have about religious bullying as we go along. So again, feel free to just chime in and ask questions if you have any. In my study, I spoke with students, with some teachers, and with some parents, and just community members and community leaders in both contexts. And one quote that stands out is this one. So I'll read the English one, but the French one is there, of course, for more clarity. The English quote here reads, "My son is always coming home and saying, 'Mom, this person said this, and this person said that, and this person told me that because if Donald Trump becomes president, I'm going to be kicked out because they say that I'm, related to, I'm Muslim and I can't live here anymore.'" So this was a mother who was telling me the experiences of her son who was in 5th grade, a Muslim mom, Muslim son, and how he was bullied in school and on the playground by classmates. This was in September 2016, before Donald Trump was elected as a US president. So the conversations that was happening in society was impacting this 5th grade student's life on the playground and at school. And on top of that, at his mosque, because he's of racial minority, he wasn't the same racial background as everyone else, nor the same ethnic background. Some people, some other kids at the mosque said, "You're not a real Muslim." So there were many different aspects of tensions and power dynamics happening for this boy at school, and he just could not understand. And so speaking with the mom, she was trying to help him, but she was really finding it hard herself because the teachers didn't help her at school when she shared this with the teachers. So this is an example of religious bullying at many different levels, in many different places. So as we're thinking about this, really, why is religious bullying important to even think about, right? Why are we talking about this? Why is it important? And there's many different types of bias-based bullying, prejudice-based bullying, but one distinct feature about religious bullying is that it does touch upon people's religious, spiritual, and non-religious identity. And these identities that people choose or they affiliate with are very personal for them. And it relates to the big questions in the world, such as what is the meaning of life? Who am I? What happens after death? All of these big questions that people ask, and everyone comes to these identities in different ways. And in English, one way to capture all of this is the 3 Bs. So people will affiliate to the 3B or make an affiliation based on the 3 Bs. It can be based on their behavior, their sense of belonging, or an actual belief that they have. So when we think about behavior, that could be that going out in nature is how one person consistently connects to the universe. That is their sense of understanding of the world when they are in nature. That's their behavior. Others will wake up every morning or late at night and meditate. And that's how they connect to the world, to something bigger than themselves. Others will say, I affiliate because of my sense of belonging. My parents are from this community. My grandparents are from this community, and my great-grandparents are from this community. Therefore, I am, because that's how I know who I am, what I'm connected to, what came before me, what comes before me, and what is in front of me now for the future. That's who I am. So that's belonging. And others people will say, this is my belief. I choose not to believe, and this is why, or I choose to believe, and this is why. So these are all very personal aspects for individuals. So when someone is bullied based on that, it hits an aspect that helps them connect to the rest of the world. And also, in another sense, bullying and religious bullying, is important to understand because it relates to public health and it is a social problem. And why is that? So for a long time now, people have kind of heard the term bullying, and some people actually don't want to hear it anymore because it's been a term for so long. But the reality is, whether we want to hear the word or not, and it still happens, and it has these types of impacts. that impacts people at an individual level, which informs how they interact with larger society, which is why this is a social problem as well as a public health concern. So when we think about bullying, and this is for all types of bullying still, that there are many ways that bullying manifests itself. It can be physical, where one person punches another or pushes another, or it can be verbal when something is said in a very derogatory manner, or it can be social, where nothing is said, but they're just excluded. And that's a different type of pain as well. And then there's cyber bullying, which can be consistent 24 hours and can be balloon into a lot of people interacting and being part of the bullying. In terms of the prejudices, today, yes, we are talking about religious bullying, but the reality is religious bullying connects to many aspects of these different prejudices as well, especially race and sexual orientation as well sometimes, and then abilities. So there's many different types of bullying that requires attention. And the reality that there are overlapping aspects, but we need to address each bias because there's a root to that bias, a root to that prejudice. And so what are the effects? The effects are the things that are what we see. So that is, this affects people's social health, their mental health, their physical health, and their studies when we think about students. And these are important to keep in mind because the more we identify and recognize these signs and effects, the more we can support the students or youth or even coworkers in our spaces. Because this also, I found in my studies, happens in workplaces, although my study was students first. And so an example I have is when I was sharing my study with a girl who had graduated. She had graduated CEGEP, university, everything. And I shared this with her and she said, you know what? I had a best friend in high school and I didn't even know that she was bullying me. It was just because she was my best friend. And I just couldn't sleep well. I couldn't eat well. I didn't want to do anything. And she was just saying things that I thought was a joke. But later on in life, I realized that it wasn't a joke. And I couldn't do anything because I didn't see it. If I knew what was happening, I would have told my mom because she's my best friend, but I couldn't even tell my mom. So these are things to keep in mind where as adults, if we're able to recognize this, we can then ask questions and maybe offer more support than a youth, for example, might be experiencing or aware of. And these are all important aspects to consider because really the effects of bullying don't only impact the person who experiences a bullying, but it also, many studies have shown it impacts those who commit and do the bullying themselves, as well as people who witness the bullying, so the bystanders. All of these people are impacted when these power dynamics are at play. And so what is important to consider is as it impacts someone in their childhood, it can later on continue to affect them in adulthood. So there is intra and intergenerational impacts and cycles of bullying so that a child will carry this into adulthood and an adult can share this with the next generation as well. So again, when we think about this, going back to specifically religious bullying, why do we need to pay attention to this? And the reality is that it is honestly just commonly overlooked, misunderstood, or underreported. And there's many reasons for this that I came across in my study, but mostly really capsulated in 3 other studies that I came across. So in the US in particular, an Hindu organization, a Sikh organization, and a Muslim organization reported on bullying amongst youth, religious bullying amongst youth in each of their communities. And all of them found these common reasons as to why bullying happens and why students don't report. Number 1 is fear. A lot of students are afraid to report because they don't think people will agree with them. And there's so many levels to fear that we'll explain in 6 and 7, reason 6 and 7, but fear is number 1. And then number 2 is that students are embarrassed, and they don't want anyone to know what's already happened to them. Number 3 is thinking it was a joke and that it wasn't a big deal. But the problem is when students think maybe, oh, somebody called me a terrorist, that's a joke. The findings are later on in life, people are still always thinking about it. They kind of, students set it aside, but then it seeps in later on. Number 4 here, it says they don't report because they think it won't help. They think it's pointless because it's happened again and again, and it will just happen again and again. So it won't make a difference if they even tell. And some students don't want to tell, number 5 here, because they don't trust adults. They don't think the teachers or the administrators respect them or want to help them. Number 6, related to fear, is that some students are afraid of being called a tattletale. And they're afraid that the person who bullied them will just make it worse because they've tattletaled on them. And then number 7 is that they're afraid of bringing it up because not only the interaction between the bully, but they're afraid that more people will know. Then this, if they report, more attention will be brought to this whole conversation. And so in this whole conversation, this topic of religious bullying, all of these aspects are important because depending on the school or the community that you work in, the context is important. You need to create the space for students to want to report, for people to want to report, and show that you have an understanding of this topic. And if we talk broader,
excuse me, Alice, I beg your pardon. It's just that we saw 2 questions in the chat, and you asked us to tell you if you didn't notice. So would you like to hear the question right now, or do you prefer to wait after your presentation?
Oh, thanks. I'm looking at them right now.
The first one is comes from Olivier Avant. He tells, as a teacher, he asks, as a teacher, and since you talked about Muslim women, what is your take on Law 21? Very good questions, very good question, Olivier. Prohibiting any state workers to wear or show religious symbols. It seems that this law applies more to that group, Muslim women. Do you think it will amplify or diminish religious-based bullying in schools?
Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much for that question, Olivier. Sorry, I didn't see it earlier, but I think my personal take on Law 21 is that it is prohibitive in many ways. I can understand the perspectives that led to this law in some ways, but when it comes to religious bullying, it's in many ways taking out the symbol and taking out the conversations, which we know there's changes now to the previous ECR program, the ethics religious culture program. All of these details, bit by bit, communicates what is depicted on this slide, essentially, that I'm sharing with you, communicates to the students at the center of the slide, that the culture and the policies in the province that they live in are minimizing this aspect of their identity, and not and creating laws to minimize it, and not give everyone the same opportunity to express themselves, or opportunity to work in the province that they maybe were born in, but very much were educated in order to become a teacher, for example. And so there is a power imbalance there that's been created for those who do wear religious symbols against those who don't. And so especially for Muslim women, it's Muslim women, it's those who are Sikh women who wear a turban as well, Sikh or Jewish men who wear the kippah, and Sikh men who wear the turban. So all of these groups choose to express themselves in these ways because it's a part of their commitment to a higher power, and it's a relationship and that reflects another part of who they are. And so I think this law, it applies to many groups. It does when we're thinking of teachers in particular, because out of all of these minorities, a large number, or the largest, or a large, not the largest because I don't have the statistics for it, but a large group of individuals out of all of these minorities are Muslim women who are teachers. So it really does disadvantage them from having these opportunities. So in many ways, it does speak to Muslim women in particular. So hopefully that kind of answers part of your question, but to your very final question here, do you think it will amplify or diminish religious-based bullying in schools? I think, sadly, with Law 21, as well as the changes to the curriculum, the ECR curriculum, I think it will potentially amplify it, or it may contribute to amplifying it, along with other aspects of society, which this illustration I have on the slide, this depicts. So it's one of many pieces that will lead to an amplified incidences of religious bullying in schools and harassment overall and discrimination.
Thank you, Alice. If I may, I would add that indeed many indicators show an increasing religious discriminations in many sites like school. As I put in the chat, we did a survey in 2020 with OFDE on the effects of Law 21 on religious discrimination faculty education students. And it's very clear that people have, including sometimes parents, have different expectations about teachers, about many employees in the schools, and there are also more hate crimes in the province. So it's not very good news. You have another question, if you want to answer it now, from Anne-Suzanne Lier. On Oliver's question, have you had to comment on the news of the expulsion from a school in Chelsea, Quebec, of a primary school teacher for wearing a hijab?
No, I haven't had a chance. I haven't commented on this, and I also, to be very honest, sadly haven't heard of this case. I will definitely read up on it. Thank you, Anne, for bringing it up. Part of my, I will definitely read up on it. Thank you so much. Just hearing about it now, though, is disheartening, is I guess the word, the simplest word. But that's, I will need more details and read more on it. But it is a reflection of essentially what this sphere I have here for us to see on the slide. It's a theoretical approach to understanding how complex this issue is. And so for all types of bullying around the world, most, if not all, bullying scholars. Oh, thank you, Jennifer, for putting in the case about the incident in Chelsea. But yes, so for most scholars in bullying, we are very familiar with Bronfenbrenner's social-ecological framework, and others who work in public health matters. So you see here a reference to the CDC in the US and the WHO that works with violence prevention. They all refer to this framework because it helps us analyze all the different spheres of society and how it impacts what happens to the individual in the center of this image. So this is a 2D image, but really it's 3D. And so if we think about the individual at the center, that individual exists and engages consistently within a microsystem. And that is their family unit, that is their school, if they're students, the religious building that they might belong to, other maybe community centers, gyms that they belong to, etc., etc. So the microsystem is where they engage regularly and have direct contact. The mesosystem is where all of these groups within the microsystem engage. So your larger neighborhood, your larger borough or your city. And then the exosystem is where larger groups or exist, such as industry, media, politics. All of these aspects of ecosystem don't inform the person at the individual level directly, but they have policies, for example, that informs what happened to them over a period of time. And what happens in the ecosystem informs the mesosystem and then the microsystem. And surrounding all of this is the reality that there are macrosystems that exist. And these are the attitudes, the ideologies, the cultures that inform all of this. And all of these spheres are porous. They inform each other throughout time, which is a chronosystem. So things consistently change over time. And what happened, for example, in 2011 or 2001, 9/11, still inform us today, for example. So this is why context is important, because what happens in Montreal is not what happens in Quebec City or what happens in St. John's, because I know people here, Jennifer is joining from Newfoundland, and I know some people are here joining from Edmonton, Alberta. And so just recognizing that all of these places across the country and even parts of one city are all unique is how we can start to analyze what happens for the student at their individual level, or even not just the student, but the colleague that we have, the community that we work with, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very powerful framework to guide us in this conversation on religious bullying in particular too. And so an example that I came across when I was doing my studies and my research in Montreal is this quote. So this is a quote from Sarah, who at that time lived in Ville-Émard, which is one of the boroughs of Montreal. And so she says here that, I'll read it in English as well, because that's how she shared her thoughts with me at first. Her quote here says, "There are so many different boroughs and kind of segregated almost. You find the Anglophone and Francophone, and it's completely separated and racially separated. I don't know, I don't find it very inclusive at all. I think the general feeling is still a bit standoffish with everybody." So what she means by standoffish is just people aren't close with each other. They want to keep a distance from each other. And that's how she described the borough, Ville-Émard, the area the neighborhood where she lived. And so later on, not included in this quote, is a story she told me about her best friend in high school who at the time was Muslim. And in class, she had her hijab pulled off. And so the teacher said nothing. And Sarah was just so upset, and her best friend was upset. But this was something that was common in the school, even though the school was predominantly students who were non-white. But what she found was this portion at the bottom of the page. This quote, the rest of her quote says, "A lot of the perpetrators at school were the white students there. So even if you are the minority, you're not the minority. Do you know what I'm saying?" So what she was saying is that the white students were the minority at the school, but they didn't see themselves as minority in society. So they felt within the school, they had the power and the agency to do things like that, pull a student's hijab off. Those, maybe not the exact same students, but there were also students who, she told me, spoke negatively and approached a parent negatively during parent-student teacher night. And and that's the time when the teachers actually spoke up, because students had impacted a parent on school grounds. So this is a type of power dynamics that exists in different layers in different parts of the city. Even though physically within the school they weren't a minority, they perceived themselves as a majority because they affiliated with the rest of the society. So this is what I found is about religious bullying. It's very complex. And my big question related to all of this was, how do I address this? Which is why I did my studies in Montreal, as well as in Modesto, California. In both Modesto, California and Montreal, uniquely in all of North America, there were mandatory religious literacy courses. So as we know, many of us know, Quebec had the ethics and religious culture course. And then in Modesto, California, specifically for 9th grade students at that public school district, they had a world geography and world religions course. So I wanted to go and explore what is this thing called religious literacy that these students are learning, and can it help students? So from all of my exploration, yes, in these contexts, but also in other parts of the US and other parts of and Europe, I found that this is what religious literacy is. Summarized in 5 principles. Religious literacy is not reading and writing about religion, but rather it's a framework to help us navigate the knowledge, and it incorporates a lot of skills to help us navigate this broad topic of religious literacy. So for today, I'll just briefly summarize these 5 principles for us. And again, feel free to ask any questions if you have any. So the first principle is that within all of these traditions, religious, spiritual, and non-religious, which is what us at the Center of Civic Religious Literacy and many that I'm talking with today and in different countries around the world, there's an inclusion of spirituality and non-religion. But in all of these conversations, each one of these traditions are unique and internally diverse. So what we know is, for example, because the Christian population is the largest in Quebec, we know that within Christianity, there are those who are Protestant, those who are Catholic, and those who are Orthodox. Even within Orthodoxy, we know that there's Russian Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and each one of these are similar, but because of the national history that they have, they are all a little different. So they're expressed differently. Different celebrations exist, and as well as how they're celebrated. So that's the internal diversity that's very important. The second one here is that all these traditions are unique. They might be similar, but they're unique. So that Hinduism and Sikhism and Buddhism, they have similarities, but they're all unique. And thirdly, here in the third principle here is that all these traditions change over time. Nothing is static. They all change over time because they're influenced by the economic, social, political aspects of all societies that they belong to, and influence them in turn. So for example, in Montreal, we have one quick example is the Jewish General Hospital. It's a Jewish hospital. It was created because of the need to have a Jewish hospital for Jewish people, but through the leadership of Jewish individuals in Montreal and philanthropy of many, now we have this benefit of the Jewish General Hospital. That's just one example of how traditional Jewish views have led to the benefit of the larger society. At the same time, we know that society influences all of these traditions. It's very clear during the pandemic where lots of people have had to change every aspect of how they celebrate different holidays because of the pandemic and all of these restrictions. So what this means for the future and maybe how Diwali might be celebrated, we don't know. But right now, it has completely changed how all of these holidays and traditions are celebrated. The fourth principle here is that very much, especially in Canada, as I'll show you in the next slide, we have to include those who are non-religious as well as spiritual, and especially recognize Indigenous spiritualities understood in many different ways across the country. And then lastly is the recognition that all these worldviews are very personal. We kind of talked about that already, but that they're personal, which means that the terms that we use and the perspectives that people use to share them differ. So how this relates to Quebec, for example, is, I lost my mouse. Okay, there we go. How this relates to Quebec is this. Oh, I apologize. It did have statistical details here. I don't know what happened to this slide, but I'm happy to share it with you verbally that here, this green part of the pie represents the over 80% of people in Quebec who, as of the 2011 in the National Household Survey, self-affiliated with being Christian. And this large navy block here represents those who are Catholic in affiliation in particular. And here in these subsets, they listed those who are Anglican, Baptist, Lutheran, Orthodox, Pentecostal, many different groups to highlight the internal diversity that exists within these groups. And this large gray pie here is actually reflects those who are non-religious, the second biggest group in Quebec. So for all these reasons, it is important to that religious literacy helps us understand what already exists, to engage with what exists in our society, and to have the language to support and recognize the students so that religious bullying can be minimized or ideally prevented, to explain and engage with this, what already exists in the province. So the next part, I just want to help us think a bit more about who we are and then also what religious literacy means in society. So on this slide here, and I invite you to just unmute if you'd like to share your answer, or you can put it in the chat box. But the question I have for you is, who is a Muslim in this slide? Out of A, B, C, D, E, F, who is a Muslim? And I know it could be a difficult question to put you on the spot, but just so you're aware, it's also, I've heard all different types of responses from different people, those who are Muslim, those who are non-Muslim, and I'm happy to share those with you in just a sec. But this exercise is really to help us reflect on our own religious literacy, our own understanding, and also what society's level of religious literacy is.
I would say only F, because she's the only one wearing, for sure, a headscarf. That would be my guess.
Thanks for sharing. So lots of different responses have come in. And the answer is all of them. And so let me go through them to explain who each person is and give you the details. And then I'll go into explain the different answers that I've received from different groups. So first here is A. This is a picture of an Indonesian Muslim girl. And often, especially in North America and parts of most of Europe, we forget that Indonesia has the largest Muslim population in the world. And so when we see young girls or individuals with same color skin as this girl, we may not know that she's Muslim just because we, in our social media, in our media, portray Muslims as much darker. B here is an individual who wrote an article in CBC actually saying that he is a Muslim raised Lebanese in Canada who actually has a privilege of being white passing. And so he explains that, again, because of his color of his skin, even though his mom wears hijab and her name is Amal, a lot of people look at him and assume that he's not Muslim, but he is. Here, C, we have a Bosnian Muslim woman in Southern California. And this was an article that I read while doing my research in California. And I shared this activity, very similar, though not exactly the same pictures, because I wanted to make it a bit more locally relevant for the California participants that I had. But when I showed this picture in particular of C, a lot of the Muslim youth that I met at the mosque said, she's not Muslim, she can't be Muslim. And so I clarified, actually, she's just she's the Nele and she is a Muslim. She's a Bosnian Muslim woman. D here, many of you might recognize him from lots of great movies and TV shows. This is Omar Sy. He is an actor, French actor, and he is a Muslim. E here is Samra Habib, who is a Pakistani-Canadian photographer, writer, and activist. And she in particular has written a book called Just Me and Allah, which is a photography project where she documents the lives of LGBTQ Muslims and to talk about her own identity as being a queer Muslim woman, but also the realities of living in this intersection. And the last one here, some of you might be familiar with her. This is Fariha Nakhi Mohammed, and she is a video journalist with City News Montreal. And she also writes often for Montreal Gazette. So all of these individuals self-affiliate themselves as Muslims, but as you can see, their racial identity is different, their ethnic identity is different, and how they express their Muslim identity is different for all of them. And so this is something for us to keep in mind in terms of the internal diversity among those in different communities, and for example here, the Muslim community. Afioma?
We have a question.
Oh, sorry.
As you asked, we will, if it's okay with you, we will go on with Ifioma and Gabo. I don't know if I pronounce it well. I beg your pardon if it's...
Yes, in Nabo. I just wanted to make a comment to it. Like in this exercise, asking who would be Muslim, it's not necessarily pointing to the woman who was wearing the headscarf, because that is a visible representation of belonging to a certain religion, like practicing Islam. But it's not to say that the other examples weren't. It's just that there wasn't any identifier to confirm, right? So I just wanted to clarify that it's not saying because she is, the others wouldn't be or couldn't be. It's just that you don't know, right? We see symbols like this all the time, right? Like, let's say you see somebody wearing sports gear. You could say, oh, well, they could be a swimmer or they couldn't. Like you're not going to know or assume, you know, or have shock. But I just want to clarify.
No, thank you so much for that clarification. That is really absolutely why this is, I always try to include an activity like this, because often people assume affiliation based on physical outer expressions, whereas for a lot of people, it is a very personal reason of why they affiliate and how they express that affiliation. It differs between everyone depicted here and even others we see in society. So thank you, Ifioma. I really appreciated that. Thank you. In addition to this slide, I wanted to, and to the question and answer that Stephanie raised earlier, I found this just again focusing on Quebec, because we are, this is hosted by UQAM, even though we really welcome those who are from out of province, but this is an important aspect to point to in terms of why this is important and why both Stephanie and I feel that there are issues with Bill 21, Law 21, and why religious literacy is needed and why religious bullying needs to be better understood. Here, this is data from the Quebec government showing that the hate crimes that have changed from 2010 to 2018 and what they've received so far for 2019 and what might change. And I've highlighted here that hate crimes based on religion, and they've broken down the different religious groups that have reported hate crimes. But as you can see here, the number of hate crimes have increased dramatically, specifically for Muslims, and they are those who are most targeted in Quebec. From 15 to 52, which is 350% increase in those 8 years. And as we can see in 2019, it's the highest. And there's still data coming in to confirm the actual numbers, but this is a provisionary number so far. So absolutely, there is a clear need in Quebec to talk about this and to address it. So in terms of my findings, I wanted to just conclude and let you know what I found. Yes, I understand now what religious bullying is, and I've shared it at high level with you, as well as what is religious literacy. So my question in the big research was, can religious literacy support or address religious bullying? And my findings were that it's a yes and no answer. So from the students that I spoke with in Modesto, California, and in Greater Montreal, the majority of them, though this study was not representative of the population, but the majority of those I spoke with said, yes, this is it. The ERC was beneficial. The World Religions and World Geography course in Modesto was beneficial. At the same time, there were many stories that I found in these different studies that I have here on the top right-hand corner from the US, as well as conversations I had with students who showed that it's not beneficial. Depending on some teachers, students said, I went to class and the teacher pretty much said, hinted that everything that she was teaching is false, but she had to teach it anyways. And so these are part of going back to the social ecological framework, the circles of how society and individuals impact what actually the experiences of the student and the individual at the center of it. So really, overall, what I found then is that for religious literacy to be beneficial, we need a sound curriculum, adequate and proper teacher training, support from school administrators, and passionate teachers who can teach neutrally about religions. Because only then will you be able to have religious literacy that can foster respectful attitudes, understanding, knowledge about different beliefs. And in that, there is a potential for addressing religious bullying from occurring. So just quickly to summarize, really, I found that context is so important. What I found in the US, there are similarities to Montreal, but a lot of differences at the same time. And so what was interesting is that a lot of the students actually talked more about their experiences at the school level more than what happened in class. So the culture, the environment is so important for students. As well, I found that religious literacy is part of the solution to a big problem. Not the only solution, but a part of the solution. As well, when there is religious literacy, it's important to have dialogue and also interaction between different groups. And the quotes here pretty much show that the students that I spoke with in both contexts said the course was beneficial because it not only helped them understand themselves and ethical dilemmas that they had, but it also helped them understand others in their society. So my recommendation for everyone is, first and foremost, please understand what is religious bullying so that you'll be equipped to respond to it, or at least know how to identify it. And then because that way it can minimize larger concerns from happening in public and social and health. And then also religious literacy, a lot of people don't realize that it's a framework. It's a tool to guide us in exploring these big topics. So as a tool, it's helpful to be used, not to be feared, but to be used to guide the conversation. And there's many more concrete recommendations in my book, and that I encourage you to take a look at. Concrete recommendations for students, administrators, parents, policymakers, curriculum developers, and community leaders. So thank you so much for sharing your time with me, and I'm happy to talk about the questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Alice, for this wonderful presentation, very enriching and full of insights, very useful insights, especially for teachers, but others also. So would you like to answer directly the different questions in the chat, or would you like to people to ask them maybe orally?
I can, if people prefer to answer them or ask them orally, that's fine. I'm just seeing Olivier's question here, so I just read through it, and maybe I can address that one first. So Olivier, your question is trying to understand, is it beneficial to underline our differences? And will this, do you think that talking about or underlining our differences will have the effect to amplify them? And so my quick answer is, it depends. The first part is, no, I don't think it will amplify them, but it will help us understand each other much more. Because a lot of the studies that I've read, and also students that I've talked to, they said when they understand others' differences, they're in the process of reflection, and then it makes them think about themselves, and it helps them understand themselves much more. So in that way, it's kind of learning through diversity about yourself and others. At the same time, I'm seeing your example here about Morgan Freeman. Racism will stop when people stop calling me a Black man instead of Morgan Freeman. and when I'll stop calling a white man instead of the interviewer's name. So I think in that instance, because of how it's framed and the conversation, the reasoning of why the diversity is raised, I think that's problematic, because it's pointing to perhaps a lot of power dynamics to say, you're a Black man, I'm a white man. These are things that we see, but how we bring up the diversity, I think, is just as important as why we're bringing it up. And so there is absolutely a lot of strength and power in recognizing diversity, for at least for the example that I've shared among many others. But I think it's how we communicate this diversity is absolutely vital. It goes back in my mind to the conversation I had with one of the students who said, you know, my teacher taught the ECR, but she taught it in a way to tell us all that it's useless. So it was all there, the content was there, but the tone and the purpose and the personal side just comes out, and that's what the student found. So I think hopefully that helps you with your the question. And Ifioma, you said, oh yes, Lyle? Go ahead.
Yes, I just wondered, in general, is there a reason why you chose the terminology of bullying as opposed to, you know, understanding or civility or religious tolerance, or and does bullying work more with students than it would with adults?
So I chose the term bullying because that's honestly the language in the Toronto area where I was teaching. That's the language that was used at the time to understand bullying. And instead of using the terminology of teaching tolerance and things like that, bullying it's very specific. There's been a lot of work done on bullying already. The specific definition of bullying always, like the definition of religion, is kind of up in the air for a lot of people as to like what this word means, because it encapsulates so many things. But even then, it is a bit more specific than the word of intolerance, because intolerance can mean harassment, teasing, and whatnot, whereas bullying really hones in on the power dynamics and the effects that come out from it, which is why I leaned more towards that, even though even today, a lot of educators across Canada like the word aggression instead of bullying. But even regardless of the word, I guess, at the practical level, I think the meaning and the studies that have been done behind the word bullying really is a reason in itself to continue using that word, from a theoretical perspective at least. And then your second question was, sorry, could you repeat your second question?
Well, I was just sort of assuming that perhaps bullying was more actively focused. It's more of a action verb, but does bullying lose any of its effectiveness if you're approaching it with an adult population?
Yeah, thank you. Sadly, I think yes. So when we're talking among bullying between adults, I'm only starting to see within the past few years some more research about bullying in the workplace. A lot of, I believe the challenge with that is bullying started off in the schoolyard. So when people hear that word, there's already a stigma around it and a preconceived notion around that word. So it seems childish and inappropriate for the workplace. But the reality is that exists at more, well, I wouldn't say more detrimental levels, but it can impact people's economic well-being. It can impact their job security, so their livelihood. So in that sense, it's just as important to bring that word and those ideas among adults. And I think sadly it loses meaning, but perhaps more conversation and more studies from, I think I'm seeing a lot from business schools, will bring this into the forefront.
Thank you, Alice.
Sometimes adults act very childish.
Please don't forget that you had another question from Jennifer Selby. I don't know if Mrs. Selby would like to talk to you, or.
And just before Jennifer's question, I also noticed that Ifioma asked if we can share the slides. I just put in my email address, so if you can email me if you'd like the slides, I can send you a version later. And then Jennifer, your question, you had 2 questions. Sorry, I'm just reading them now.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question is, can you say more comparatively about the political context in Quebec and California, and whether you think these impacted the reception of religious literacy? So it's hard to say about the political context. They're very different in some cases, but then at the same time, during the time of my study between 2015 and 2017, there were a lot of similarities because of the US elections for Donald Trump. And so in both politically, in both Quebec and California, I saw, and US, not just California, I saw that there was a large political movement to take away religion from public conversation. At the same time, in 2017, that's when the shooting and massacre happened in the Quebec City Mosque. And that's when there was a Muslim ban, as he put it, in early 2017 in the US against majority Muslim countries. So there's very clear political and social events that coincide. But in terms of how they impacted the reception of religious literacy, this is where it gets complicated because of the history of the Modesto program. So the Modesto program started in 2000, actually. So it's existed for 21 years already. And so it's 8 years older than the Quebec program. And it was created from teachers in the school district, whereas the Quebec program was created top down in relation to the history of Quebec and Quebec schooling. So in terms of how religious literacy is, the reception is very different, because one is through all grade levels in Quebec, or it was, whereas it was just for 9th grade students in California, in Modesto, California. So the reception was much warmer in California than it has consistently been in Quebec, to put it plainly and simply. And then your second question is, what would it mean to replace religious literacy with anti-racism curriculum? I'm wondering about the meaning of the content of religion in your work, particularly in context of settled colonial white supremacy. Yeah, so I think religious literacy would be absolutely a component of the anti-racism curriculum, but it shouldn't take over, but because it doesn't capture absolutely everything. But it is an aspect that does relate to settler colonial white supremacy, because depending on the white supremacist group, there are Christian underlines to those conversations. And also, depending on what part of the country we're talking about, settler colonial history, or many parts of the country, when we think about reconciliation, religion was very much a part of colonialization. And so making sure this is all part of the conversation is what religious literacy can do to open up the anti-racism curriculum and add another lens to this complex conversation of what is anti-racism. Because when we look at the internal diversity, we know that race is part of that internal diversity of a lot of traditions and different groups. So hopefully that answers your questions, Jennifer. If not, just let me know. Then I see Olivia's.
We have also a question from Michael Gillingham. I think that was the next question. Oh no, excuse me, you were right. Olivia Ponte-Corvo. What do you think of the recent changes made to the ERC course in Quebec?
Thank you, Olivia. And I'll come back to your question for sure, Michael, too. We'll make it down the list. But in terms of the recent changes made to the ERC, myself and Pretty much everyone on my team at the Center for Civic Religious Literacy were all quite disappointed. On my team, there are people who have taught the ERC or continue to at the high school level, and individuals who have done studies about the ERC and also live in Montreal, live in Quebec, and know the value of the ERC program. Despite its needs for improvement, there was a lot of value to start and open the conversation. So I know the new ERC program, or it will change into called culture and citizenship. And so that is taking out the religious culture component completely. And so my overall thoughts is that is, for everything that I showed you today, that really silences a lot of groups to know how to, recognize their presence in Quebec, but also recognize the history and how they've influenced the province, as well as continue to influence. Also, that it just silences the opportunity to talk about a group that currently lives in the province. And the reality is, much of the country doesn't have world religions courses or anything like the ERC. And so when we go to different parts of the country, and where I used to teach in Toronto, we knew the diversity was there, but we didn't talk about it because there was no course. There was nothing that opened up that space and comfort for us to talk about it, unless you taught a specific world religions course in a public non-Catholic high school. And so that's very specific. And, it's just simply put, I think it's not just a missed opportunity, but potentially quite harmful. And as we're seeing with the hate crime numbers, by removing the voice of different groups, it can lead others to speak up more instead. So thank you, Olivia, for that question.
I don't know if Olivia wanted to add something, or okay. Otherwise, we have Michael Gillingham. Would you like to ask your own question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alice, for your presentation. First of all, really, really interesting. Great to hear the discussion even already. But yeah, just appreciated you positioning yourself, and wondering what you're doing with that question when you're teaching in either a high school or university context. Do you share that information, and when and how would you do that, or do you refrain? Just an interesting question that I know I struggle with a little bit personally too. And I know the students that I work with are always wondering, they're trying to situate you or place you even if you don't say anything, right? So
Always.
Yeah, anyways, just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think students are wonderful because they're curious. They might take your course because they're interested in the content, but when they like the teacher, they want more about you. And they just want to know about you. So I've seen different examples of this, and I've also done this in many different ways, just depending on when it's appropriate, depending, how much time I have with the students, what I'm talking about. Because sometimes I think it's beneficial for them to know who we are, but other times I think it's much more beneficial for them to know each other. And so what I've seen is, I'll give you examples of what I've seen, and then I'll tell you a bit more, maybe if I can think about it, the example of what I've done. But what I've seen is, for example, a world religions teacher in the Toronto area. She was a fantastic world religions teacher, and she herself is sick. And so she said, I will tell my students just through conversation. As we're learning about things, about different traditions, she will say, these are the important, or sorry, let me just stop sharing screen there, and then we could just see each other better. She will share that I have, these are the different holy scriptures that we're talking about. Mine is, and then she'll explain, and in conversation, she'll say, on Sunday or over the weekend, I went to, the Gurdwara. And then we listened to the Guru Granth Sahib. Like it's just part of her conversation when she's chatting with students, so that it becomes normalized and students feel comfortable sharing about themselves if they want. And I think she also shares who she is with parents as well at the beginning of a lot of the courses that she does, she calls each and every parent to let them know, this is what I'm teaching with your students. Do you have any questions? This is who I am. And this is why I think it's important that we have this course. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. So she not only tells her students, but she tells the parents so that there's open understanding. Another teacher that I met in California, she herself is non-religious, but she says her students will always ask her, what do you believe? Because it seems like you believe in every single tradition that you're teaching. You just seem so passionate about every single one. And so she tells them at the end, she's like, you know what? I'm non-religious, but I respect each and every one. And that's why you felt the way that you did. So she does it at the end. For me, I think I've done it different ways, as I mentioned, but I will, as I'm doing here, and especially with students, I like to build relationships and keep things informal so people are comfortable asking questions or sharing as best as possible. And so I will often share the story I shared with you today about my dad passing away and how important that is to me and how difficult it was for me. And then even seeing religious bullying at school among my students, and how, although those students weren't Christian, I could imagine a piece of how confused the student was, or what that might mean for different students. So just sharing a bit of myself, why I do this, why it's important to me, so that students can also do the same if they want. So different ways of doing it. Hopefully that helps, Michael.
Merci à vous deux. Alors, la parole est maintenant à Natacha Ingold pour la prochaine question.
Oui, bonjour, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation, Alice. So I'm actually an elementary school teacher, so it's a little bit different in the context. And I had a great fondness for the ERC program. So I was really interested to hear what you had to say. And I'm kind of wondering how can we continue, like, especially in a Quebec context, I think many of us are in this context, how can we continue to bring religious literacy as this program changes? So maybe it's not so much of I don't think it's a particular answer, but that's my thoughts are, how do I continue to kind of raise awareness in my students that this is a part of our society, this is a part of who we are. So rather than saying, no, we don't talk about it, like we're all closing our eyes and we're turning the other way, how do we continue to make safe spaces for our students to talk about it? And how do we help our families in our schools and our colleagues to feel comfortable to continue to engage in this conversation, even while the program is kind of changing? And I have some kind of worries about the program changing as well, but that's another thing.
No, thank you for joining, because teachers have a really tight schedule. So both you and Michael sound like your teachers. So I'm
actually on maternity leave, so I've got my little guy here with me.
Very nice. Hello. No, that's great. I think just having, I feel like elementary school teachers have an advantage a little bit more than secondary school teachers in some ways around this, because you have a bit more, your schedule's a little bit more flexible. It's not, so confined to certain periods that you have to get all your content done. So that opens up the opportunity for discussion. So it's kind of talking about, what you're, I heard this, depending on what grade you teach, I guess, it's kind of, bringing in social and current events into the classroom, talking about that, and talking about holidays that have come up, whether students, relate to these holidays or not, just bringing it into the classroom, making it part of regular conversation, I think even then opens up a lot of doors. For example, when I was teaching a 7th grade student, we never talked about religions, but he just very briefly, maybe because he was comfortable with me, we're just talking on the side at his lockers, and he was saying, Miss, I'm really excited. in this summer, I'm going to do a pilgrimage with my family. And because I knew other aspects of his family life and whatnot, I just quickly asked him, like, do you mean the Hajj? Are you doing the Hajj? And just my recognition of that, and, you know, just asking it opened up, like his eyes just lit up, and he felt, oh my gosh, she understands. Like, we hadn't talked about it before, but I created space where we could talk about it, and it's just naming something really quick helps students know that this is part of the school space, the relationship they have with the teacher. And sometimes, like, that's what it takes to start opening it up from one-on-one with you and the student to the whole class to just talk about things more. So it's very much, I think at the end of the day, more than anything, especially with students, they just want relationship building. They want recognition, right? And so if you can find a way to bring that, recognize them and others in society that they don't know about but may have questions about, I think that makes a difference. And then with colleagues, just making it regular conversation too. I think that helps. Mm-hmm. So it really, there's more specific ideas, but it really depends on every single context. It's all very different, but hopefully that helps.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Natasha. So it's almost 2:00, so I think the time came to conclude this meeting. It was wonderful to have you with us today, Alice. Thank you so much. Merci à tout le monde d'avoir été aussi avec nous aujourd'hui pour recevoir Alice. Merci.
Merci, merci tout le monde. And thank you so much for being here. And again, for Stephanie, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I think I started this research because it was clear, the need was clear to me and helping me myself as a teacher. But for others here, if you would like to learn more, you have my email address as well as access to the book. I'm happy to talk about this because that's why I did it in the first place. I think it's important to share. So just reach out to me anytime you want. And thank you again.
Thank you, and congratulations again for your wonderful book.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Au revoir.